Welcome back, everyone. In this video, I want to go over your creative headline project and a few things to consider as you work through it, along with some practical tips. Now, you can find your choices for your headlines on page 2 of your InDesign document. Over here on the right side, you will choose 3 of these headlines, but you will create 2 variations of each. And in some cases, you'll notice I've went ahead and added the genre or personality of these particular headlines that you should be shooting for whenever you choose your font. And whenever it comes to choosing a font, please make sure that you're choosing an Adobe font, not something that comes default on your system or something from another font website. Make sure that you're using an Adobe font. And of course, you can find the other different requirements for your project here as well as on your actual assignment. Now, one of the things that I like to do whenever I'm working with my text headlines is instead of putting all my text into one text box, I personally like to have a text box for each of the words going into the headline. So for example, if my headline is working with headlines, I'm going to have 3 text boxes, one for each word. Now, something to consider as you are working with multiple text boxes is that sometimes it can be difficult to select items. For example, let's say that I want to select on the word with because I want to play around with it. But whenever I go to select on it, notice how it's selecting the text box around working. In fact, if I were to move it, you'll see it's got that text box selected. And so there's a couple different ways of working with text in these type of situations. If I'm trying to get to an element that is behind something else, I can always select the element that's currently in the way and then hold down the control key and then click through that object till I get to the other one. My other option is to select the object that is currently sitting in front of the one that I want. Then I can right click it, choose arrange, and then send to back. So now, whenever I come back and try to select the word with, it's now on top of the word working. Okay, so the other thing that you can do to help sort of get through all this type of mess is to resize your text box to be the same size as your actual word. And how you do that is, I'm going to split these apart here real quick. To resize your text box to match the same size as your word, what you want to do is on your text box, notice over here on our selection points, we want to double click the middle right one right here. That'll shrink up the width. And if I double click the bottom one, center one, it'll shrink up the height. Do the same thing for the width here. Makes these a lot more manageable and a lot easier to work with and select. Now for the word headlines though, notice whenever I select it, it's tempting to want to double click on this bigger white selection point. Notice how that white square is larger than the others, but don't do that. It's very deceptive and shame on InDesign for doing that. That actually has a completely different function. To get to the actual selection point that you need to drag out and make your text box taller until you can actually see the smaller white box. So there's the one that you were seeing. Here's the one that you actually need. Once you have it out, double click that selection point, and then we'll do the same thing on the bottom. And now everything's all tightened up. Very good. Now that you have individual text boxes for each word, this allows you the freedom to move things around and enlarge them, make them smaller, anything that you can do to try to create an interesting headline. I'll give you an example. So whenever I'm working with headlines, one of the things I'd like to do is I like to see how headlines work in all caps first. And the reason I like working with all caps as one of my options for headlines is because it has this very nice flat on the top and on the bottom. It makes for placement very easy to work with. They stack very well, in other words. So in this case, you can see the word working is stacked on top of the word headlines. And the nice thing about having individual text boxes, again, it helps me to actually play around with the different sizes of text. This way I can draw specific emphasis on the words that I want. And whenever I'm working with the headline, I always go through and figure out which of the words I want to emphasize more and make those larger. So in this particular case, the word headlines stands out. So I made that the largest one on the page. Obviously, the next most important word would be working. So these two are the largest words because they're the most important. Words like with, and, or the, these are kind of minor words. And so typically I make these a little bit smaller. And you can also play with the value to sort of push that word back so it's not as prominent as the other words. Notice how we have these words in black working in headlines, which is a heavier weight. And by applying a softer or lighter value to the word with, it pushes it further back just a little bit. And so the nice thing with all caps is it makes things a little bit easier to stack on top of each other because you don't have the slight variation in height of all your letters. And I'll show you a different solution for lowercase here in just a second. So one of your variations can be working with all caps on your text. And for those of you that are working with dates, here's a couple different options of playing around with those. One of the things that I personally like to do is I love to use the line element to sort of come in and help break up space. Here's what it looks like without them. Notice how blank that looks. It just feels like a really awkward and off balance headline. So adding in those lines just helps create a more balanced feel overall. And if I'm ever using a line, personally what I like to do is I try to line up my lines so that it's at the same height if you've got all caps, that it would run all the way through where that line is on, or the arm is on the F, the E, B, R, and the A, and everything else all the way straight through. It's kind of like it's almost in the center of it. And if lines are too thin, well, you can always expand those out to be actual rectangles or shapes. A lot of different ways, and they don't have to necessarily be black. Again, you can always change the value to be something else to soften them up. There's also no reason why it needs to be in the center underneath your headline. Again, this is one of the great things about this type of project is I want you to play around with different ideas to see what you feel works best. Maybe instead of centered, we're going to do right aligned. So I'm going to come down here, right align it, and then take my line, just expand it down a little bit more. So a lot of different things. So in this particular case, this could count as one solution or one variation of my headline. Now another one could be like this. This is one that's all lowercase. This one I got a little bit more creative. Don't necessarily say that I like it, but again, part of this project is to try something different to see what you can come up with. Now, one of the great things about working with lowercase letters is that you have a lot of different types of space. Let me move this out of the way. And you'll notice in the word headlines, we've got this empty space right in here. And so I did try a couple different things. Put this back. Where, for example, the word work, set like that, I really like the way the I sort of centered itself inside the G, but the problem is I have this really awkward space on the inside right here. I tried putting the word with in there, but it still felt a bit cramped and a little bit awkward. So that's why I did what I did in just dropping the word work down just enough to sort of fill in that space, but still be able to read the word as working. And of course, there's a word with over there. So again, as I'm working with text, I try to find natural places for things to sit. Think of it sort of like shelves. So over here, you can see I did the exact same thing with the date. But one of the reasons why I made it a different shade was so it wouldn't conflict as much with the black working with headlines. This way, whenever you see it, you read the headline working with headlines, and of course, you've always got the date right there. If this were black, here's what that would look like. It would read entirely different. Working 2021 with headlines. So I'm making this a different value than the other words. It helps it to stand apart. By making it a lighter value, it pushes it backwards so that the predominant text is the actual headline itself. But again, a couple different ways for you to play around with text whenever you're creating headlines. I want you guys to get creative. I want you to play with different size words. Again, notice the word with, it's a lot smaller than the other words on here. Play around with the placement of things. Look for natural places where things can sit. And feel free to adjust as needed. And what I really want to make sure that you do is just, in your creativity, again, don't forget about readability. It's always important that the message is still very clear. So again, give it a shot, have a little bit of fun, and see what you can come up with.